The first thing I remember is the sound. Not a crash, not a shatter, just a soft, heavy thud that seemed to swallow the air in my dining room. 3 layers of chocolate and raspberry slid off the edge of my oak table, hovered for a heartbeat in the afternoon light, then surrendered to gravity frosting first onto my new hardwood floor. The candles rolled in every direction like little white bones, ribbons of red filling stretched toward the baseboards. No one moved. My nephew's hand still hovered near the platter. Jackson's mouth held a shape that wasn't quite a smile. "Eat it off the ground," Aunt Dedra Tommy said, not laughing, not testing, just delivering a line he knew would land. The room tightened around me. My mother's breath hitched one palm to her chest, as if she were startled by a sudden breeze and not a deliberate act. My father checked his watch. Vanessa tilted her phone like she might capture the mess if the light caught it just right. I held the cake knife in my hand and felt the weight of it travel up my wrist through my shoulder and into the quiet part of me where I keep all the swallowed words. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever stood in your own home and felt small in front of people who should have had your back, tap that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter of this story. To understand why that cake mattered and why the silence around it hurt more than the frosting on my floor, you need to know who I've been in this family and how long I've been paying for the privilege. I am the responsible one. That's not a compliment in our house. It's a job title. At 16, while other kids were saving for cars and winter formals, I was saving the mortgage by running registers at the grocery store after school. When Dad's hours were cut and Mom picked up double shifts at the hospital, I handed over my first paycheck without being asked. The relief in my mother's eyes felt like sunlight cracking through cloud. And I learned without anyone saying it that my usefulness could make a storm pass. Jackson learned something too. He learned that I would step in before the bill came due. He learned that problems could be softened with a grin and a promise to do better later. Later kept moving. I built my life in the spaces left over. Community college at Night State University on scholarships, and caffeine, then a grind of internships that paid in experience. Architecture is long hours and attention to detail, and I took to both. I rented a tiny office with a sliver of window and built Bradford design, one drawing at a time. When the jobs came, I said yes. When the awards came, I said nothing, because the day I won my first regional citation, Jackson needed a car to keep the job he really wanted, and the congratulations turned into co-signer paperwork. If you lined up my 20s on a shelf each year, would look like this: my name on a loan, my signature under someone else's risk. Tuition, car, ring money, a mortgage with my numbers propping up their dream of starter home. I told myself this was love, and love meant helping family get where they were going. The trouble was, I was the only one driving. Still, I wanted a home of my own. Last fall, I founded a mid-century on a quiet street with wide windows that draw the evening in like a slow breath. I peeled old paint, chose warm whites, and refinished the floors with my hands on the sander earplugs, tight music low. I kept a guest room for my parents and another for Jackson's little family, imagining sleepovers with Tommy and puzzle pieces on the rug. I bought a simple crown, a silly, glittery thing, because when I was a girl, my grandmother would place a paper tiara on my head and say, "Chin up, birthday girl," and sometimes adults need that reminder too. 2 months later, Jackson called with what he called an opportunity. His voice had that varnish it gets when he's already decided what I'm going to say. "Sis, float me 15 for 6 months. Solid returns. You'll be proud." I asked the kind of questions banks ask. He gave the kind of answers teenagers give. When I said I couldn't, the warmth in his voice peeled away like old tape. He hung up, calling me selfish. Over the next few weeks, my parents repeated gentle versions of the same idea. Family helps family. You've always been so capable. We're not asking for a gift, just a bridge. I held my ground. It felt like standing on a dock while someone you love sways between stepping onto your side or drifting off with the rope. I hated how hard my heart pounded every time the phone lit with Jackson or Mom. I hated how small the word no sounded in my mouth. When my birthday arrived on a Saturday, I decided to repaint the day with something warm and ordinary. I baked the cake the way Grandma taught me, measuring flour with the back of a butter knife, melting chocolate until it shone, spreading raspberry between the layers with a slow, patient hand. The house smelled like memory and vanilla. I strung cream and gold streamers and set a vase of white tulips at the center of the table. I polished the architectural models on my glass shelves, miniatures of projects that had taken years of my life. Each one a reminder that discipline can turn lines on paper into light and space. They were due at noon. At 1, Mom called to say they were on the way. At 1:30, they came in together, laughter still on their coats from the car. Dad's side hug was warm but brief. Mom looked around and said, "Open floor plans are impossible to heat," like she was diagnosing a minor injury. Jackson headed for the liquor cabinet without asking. Vanessa drifted room to room, phone out, narrating opinions like a tour guide with a personal brand. When Tommy saw the shelves of models, I told him softly to be careful. He tapped one with a knuckle anyway, a community center I designed last year, and I caught the base as it slid, but one thin spire snapped and fell like a tooth. "Oops," he said, and moved on. Jackson shrugged. "Kids." I took a breath, counted my inhales to 10, and brought out a handheld game I'd wrapped for Tommy, hoping to redirect his energy. "Is this the new one?" he asked, eyebrows pinched. "It came out last month. Joey has the limited edition," he said. He put it on the couch, not unkindly, like a cup you'll get to later. I told them I had good news. My firm named a finalist for an international prize in sustainable design, and my father nodded, as if I'd mentioned a weather report. Mom shared an update about a neighbor's hydrangeas. Jackson launched into fantasy football. Vanessa used her phone camera as a mirror and freshened lipstick the color of candied cherries. By 4 o'clock, the light in the living room had softened to honey, and I felt the day slipping through my fingers. I put on my paper crown, ridiculous in the reflection of the microwave door, and lifted the cake from the fridge. The frosting held its shape like satin. I carried it like something holy. They were at the table finally. I set the cake down and let myself look at that picture, the people I had carried for so long, contained in the frame of my home. A part of me still believed I could bake enough sweetness to cover everything that was sour. I thanked them for coming. I said I was glad to have everyone in my new house. The words sounded like a toast from a movie where the ending always works out. That's when I saw it, the way Tommy had slipped from his chair and circled the table like a cat folding itself under a low fence. His eyes narrowed the way Jackson's do when he's about to sell a story. Both hands reached for the platter. He wasn't clumsy. He wasn't excited. He was choosing. The slide was clean, almost graceful. The landing was not. Raspberry streaked across the floor like a tiny, ridiculous crime scene. Chocolate crumbs bounced into the seams of the boards I had finished with my own slow, careful hands. The crown on my head tilted, and for a strange second, I felt like I was watching myself from the doorway. Woman with a knife, woman in a crown. Woman in a room full of people who would not save her from this. "Eat it off the ground," he said. He looked pleased with himself in a way that felt borrowed from someone taller. I turned to Jackson because I wanted a father's voice to emerge from a brother's mouth. He raised a hand to his son's shoulder, squeezed it lightly, and let the moment hang. "Looks like somebody isn't getting cake," he joked, as if that were the balance we needed. Vanessa sang, "We don't play with food," in the tone you use for a toddler who dropped a pea, then glanced at me and added, "Though I'm probably saving you from the calories." Her smile was small and fixed. There are lines you don't know you've drawn until they're crossed. You expect your body to shout for you to buckle the table, to point to the floor, to demand what any person deserves in her own home: respect, apology, the dignity of being seen. Instead, I felt my breath grow quiet. I felt my hands find the broom closet. I felt my feet carry me into motion, because motion is how I have survived every awkward silence in this family, cleaning the mess no one admits to making. "It was an accident," Jackson said as I knelt with paper towels. "You don't have kids. You wouldn't understand. It wasn't," I said, hearing my voice as if it belonged to someone who had practiced this sentence alone. "And kids do what they're allowed to do." Vanessa flushed and straightened her shoulder straps. "Are you calling us bad parents?" My mother slipped around me to the kitchen. "I'll get paper towels," she murmured, as if I hadn't already filled both hands. My father cleared his throat and said to no one in particular, "That game starts at 6. And that was the whole of it. The verdict, the sentence, and the parole delivered in an exchange of looks and an almost joke. No apology. No arm around my shoulders. No name for what had just happened. Only the sound of frosting being lifted from wood grain and the scuff of chairs as people decided the afternoon had reached its end. The door gathered them one by one. My parents' first coats in hand. Jackson and Vanessa next, guiding Tommy like he might bruise if the air touched him wrong. At the threshold, I heard my mother whisper to my brother, "She's always been too sensitive, the way you talk about someone who catches cold in drafts." They did not say goodbye. The house refilled with its own quiet. I threw the paper towels into the trash and stood at the sink, crown lopsided hands sticky with sugar. Outside, the porch light clicked on and painted a soft circle on the front walk. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked at nothing. On the table, the tulips leaned toward one another like they were consoling themselves. I rinsed my hands and watched chocolate spin down the drain in loose spirals. The floorboards would need another pass. The model would need repair. The dining room smelled like a bakery and an argument. I felt the shape of an old ache lifting not away, but up to where I could finally see it. In the living room, my phone buzzed against the coffee table. The first vibration rolled across the wood. Then another. Then a third. A steady pulse, like a distant engine warming up. I dried my hands on a dish towel and stood in the doorway a long moment, still as cut stone, deciding whether to pick it up. The screen lit the dark room in a square of cold light. A new message waited in the family thread, words I hadn't opened yet. Words that would tell me in no uncertain terms where I stood. I reached for the phone. The glass felt cool against my palm. And in the brief breath before I read what they had sent, the house held its silence like the second just before a storm breaks. The phone screen glowed in the dark like a warning light. My thumb hovered above it before I let myself read the words that waited. "After discussing today's events, we've chosen to sever all contact. Your negativity and judgment are harmful to Tommy. Stay away forever." Below it, a small thumbs-up symbol, Jackson's name. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My pulse sounded too loud in my ears. Then the room slowly took shape again, the half-empty wine glass on the table, the folded napkins still waiting beside plates that had never been used. My birthday crown sat crooked on the chair across from me. It looked like it belonged to someone else. I sank onto the couch and held the phone to my chest. My body shook, not from anger, but from something older, an exhaustion that had no edges, the kind that lives in your bones. I had spent 34 years trying to keep this family together, and it ended with a group text. The rest of the night drifted past in fragments. I remember the soft hum of the refrigerator, the sound of wind pressing against the windows, the faint taste of chocolate still clinging to the air. I cried until the tears turned dry and heavy, then fell asleep on the sofa with a blanket pulled around me. When morning came, the light through the windows was pale and uncertain. My throat ached, my eyes swollen. For the first time in years, my phone was silent. No reminders from Mom. No messages from Jackson asking for just a quick favor. I sat there for a long while listening to the quiet. It felt foreign, like a language I'd forgotten. The first person I called was Elena. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert even before I spoke. What happened? I told her everything, my words stumbling out between shallow breaths. The cake, the silence, the text that ended decades of loyalty in one sentence. She listened without interrupting, only an occasional sharp intake of air when I reached the worst parts. They said what she finally asked. They told me to stay away forever, I whispered. Elena didn't fill the pause with pity. Dedra, that's not love, that's control. Her certainty broke something open in me. I felt the tears return softer this time. She kept talking steady and calm. You've carried them for too long. You call it helping, but it's been bleeding you dry. This isn't a family falling apart, it's a pattern breaking. The words sat heavy in my chest. I thought about every time I'd co-signed a loan, every holiday spent rescuing them from late payments and excuses. If I stop helping, I said they'll hate me. They already do, she replied gently. At least now it's for the truth. After we hung up, I sat with her words. The truth. I had avoided calling it that for years. It was easier to pretend it was love. By noon, I had made coffee I didn't drink and stared at the to-do list pinned to the refrigerator. One line caught my eye, quarterly financial review. I thought of all the signatures that weren't really mine anymore. Car loans, mortgages, lines of credit. I had turned my success into their safety net, and when I stopped stretching, they decided to cut the rope. That afternoon, I called Brian, my financial advisor. He answered on the first ring, his voice as even as it always was. I told him I needed to untangle myself from family obligations. He didn't ask why, he just said, "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring every document you have." When I hung up, I opened the file cabinet in my office. The folders were arranged neatly labeled with years and color-coded tabs. Blue for Jackson, green for my parents, yellow for the firm. I pulled them out one by one until the surface of my desk disappeared beneath them. It looked like evidence proof of a quiet crime I had committed against myself. I spent hours sorting through contracts and repayment schedules. Numbers filled the margins of my notebook, each total heavier than the last. By the time the sun dipped low behind the oak trees outside, the sum reached $130,000, most of it unpaid. I felt dizzy. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked as it cooled, the sound of expansion and settling like it was breathing beside me. I tried to picture their faces, Mom's practiced calm, Dad's uneasy quiet, Jackson's grin that never reached his eyes. But the images felt distant, almost flat. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were full of noise, slamming doors, laughter that turned to echoes, the sharp smell of burnt sugar. The next morning, the sky was clear. I showered, dressed, and drove downtown to Brian's office. The glass building caught the early sun and scattered it like water. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and citrus cleaner. Brian met me at the door, took one look at the folders in my arms, and nodded toward his desk. "Let's start here," he said. We went through everything line by line, His pen moved quietly across forms as he explained the steps requests for removal refinancing options, notices of liability transfer. His professionalism was a comfort. He never asked for the story behind the numbers. When we finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "This won't be quick," he said, "but it's the right move." I thanked him and stepped outside. The morning air felt sharper than before, as if the city itself had woken up. I sat in my car and called Tara, a friend from college who had gone into family law. She picked up halfway through the first ring, cheerful, until she heard my voice. "Something happened," she said. "I think I need legal advice," I told her. We met an hour later at a small cafe halfway between her office and mine. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversation. Tara listened as I laid out the situation, the co-signed loans, the family messages, the sudden disowning. She stirred her drink slowly, thinking. "What you're describing is financial entanglement," she said. "It happens more often than you'd think. The law can't fix emotions, but it can protect your future." Her tone was steady, reassuring. She outlined options in simple terms, explained the risks of remaining tied to people who had already shown what they were capable of. "You have every right to protect yourself," she said, "and no legal obligation to keep subsidizing them." By the time I left, I felt something close to clarity. Not peace yet, but direction. At home, I spread the folders across my dining table, the same table where the cake had fallen, and began making lists. For Jackson and Vanessa, complete separation. For my parents, a gradual unwinding with guidance, but no more financial dependence. It wasn't vengeance. It was survival. The following morning, I met Brian at the bank. He had already prepared the necessary forms. I signed each page carefully, my hand trembling only once. Every signature felt like a small act of release. When it was over, Brian said, "This may take a few months. They'll be notified." I nodded. The words sounded distant, like someone else's good news. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk watching traffic move past in even rhythm. People hurried by with coffee cups and briefcases, each of them heading somewhere they didn't have to justify. I envied that simplicity. By the time I returned to my office, my phone had begun buzzing again. Dozens of missed calls, text messages stacked like dominoes. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I called Elena and told her what I'd done. "Proud of you," she said. "It's about time." That evening, the sky turned a deep, late summer blue. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. Outside, porch lights blinked on, one by one. The neighborhood was settling into its own rhythm. For the first time in a long while, mine didn't match theirs. When I turned my phone back on, the flood came. Messages from Jackson, each more frantic than the last. One accusing me of betrayal, another claiming Mom was falling apart, a third begging to talk this through. I read them all without responding. Then came an email from Vanessa. Her tone was sweet, almost rehearsed. She wrote that Tommy was heartbroken and wanted to see me, that he didn't understand why his aunt was being so cruel. The manipulation was clear guilt wrapped in apology. I closed the message without replying. By the next day, the pressure had shifted. My parents began calling colleagues of mine, leaving messages about a family emergency. They wanted me back under control, and they were reaching through any door they could find. Elena stopped by that night, bringing takeout and calm. We ate in the kitchen, the scent of sesame oil and ginger filling the air. She showed me her phone, where Vanessa had posted carefully staged photos herself with red eyes, Jackson staring out a window, Tommy in her lap. The caption read, "Family heartbreak hurts the most. She's turning this into a story," Elena said. I smiled faintly. "Let her. I'm done performing." Later, after she left, I sat in the dim light of my living room. The silence felt heavier now, but cleaner. My phone kept vibrating across the coffee table, but I let it go until the sound stopped. Close to midnight, I walked to the back door and stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind that smells faintly of rain, even when the sky is clear. I stood barefoot on the porch looking up at the stars. They were sharp and cold, the way truth sometimes is. Through the kitchen window, I could see the reflection of my empty dining room, the table polished, the vase of tulips beginning to fade. It struck me how much the house had changed in a single week. It was still beautiful, but it no longer felt like a stage waiting for guests. It was just mine. When I went back inside, I poured the rest of the wine down the sink. The red swirl disappeared into the drain, just like the chocolate had days earlier. But this time, it didn't feel like loss. I turned off my phone, set it face down on the counter, and locked the door. The click of the bolt echoed through the quiet house, steady and final. In the darkness, I whispered to no one, "Enough." It wasn't loud, but it was the truest thing I'd said in years. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that softens edges, but leaves nothing hidden. I woke before the alarm and lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The air smelled faintly of coffee grounds from last night, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once and stopped. It was the first morning in years that I didn't reach for my phone. The day ahead felt like standing at the start of a long hallway, uncertain, echoing, but finally mine. I showered, dressed, and drove downtown to the bank for the follow-up meeting Brian had arranged. The air outside was cool and sharp. I could feel it in my lungs as I crossed the parking lot, carrying the folder that held the last of my family's signatures tied to my name. Inside, the lobby buzzed with small sounds, keyboards, paper, the faint rhythm of a printer somewhere behind the counter. Brian greeted me with his steady, calm expression. His tie was slightly crooked like always. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. The meeting was short, efficient. Each form I signed pulled another thread free. By the time we finished, my hand ached, but the weight that had lived between my shoulders for years began to loosen. When I stepped outside, the sunlight hit the glass doors behind me and reflected across the hood of my car like a blade of light. For a brief moment, I let myself smile. By the time I reached my office, the quiet freedom had already begun to shift. 3 emails waited in my inbox, all from Jackson. The first was a threat wrapped in anger. The second blamed me for everything that was falling apart. The third tried to sound reasonable, promising change if I just came over to talk. I closed the laptop without answering. That afternoon, Tara called. Her tone was even professional, but beneath it I could hear concern. "Your brother tried to reach me," she said. "He didn't like hearing that I represent your interests. What did he say? That you're destroying the family? That you're unstable?" I documented everything. I thanked her, though the words came out thin. The accusation wasn't new. My family had always been good at rewriting history. Later that day, as I left the office, I saw a familiar car idling across the street. Jackson's. The engine was still running, headlights on, even though the sky was bright. I turned in the opposite direction and walked toward the parking garage. I didn't look back. At home, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. For years, I had told myself I could fix things, that love, if patient enough, would correct every imbalance. But love, without respect, only bends one way until it breaks. When the phone rang again, I let it go to voicemail. The sound repeated until it stopped, replaced by the faint ping of new emails. I didn't need to read them to know their tone. Guilt always had the same rhythm. I spent the evening sorting through files, creating digital copies, labeling everything neatly. It was tedious, but it steadied me. Around midnight, I finally shut the laptop and turned off the lights. The house was still. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, scattering dry leaves across the porch. The next morning, I woke to another wave of messages, calls from blocked numbers, texts from unknown accounts, a new email from Vanessa with the subject line, "For Tommy's sake." I opened it only because curiosity won. Her words were polite, practiced. She said Tommy was heartbroken that he wanted to see me, that I shouldn't punish a child for adult mistakes. It might have sounded sincere to someone who didn't know her, but I recognized the strategy, emotional leverage disguised as compassion. I forwarded it to Tara and deleted it. That evening, Elena came by. She brought Thai food and a quiet strength that filled the room more than any words could. We sat at the table, the same table that had seen too much, and she scrolled through her phone. "You need to see this," she said, turning the screen toward me. Vanessa's social media page glowed back in shades of sorrow and performance photos of her with red-rimmed eyes. Jackson looking out a window like a man in mourning, Tommy in her lap, holding a stuffed bear. The caption read, "When someone you trust turns their back on you, the pain never leaves. Pray for our family." Elena sighed. "They're rewriting it already." I set the phone down and folded my napkin carefully beside the plate. "Let them," I said. "The truth doesn't need an audience." She smiled, proud and sad at the same time. After she left, I stood by the window, watching her taillights disappear down the street. The night air pressed against the glass, cool and silent. I could see my own reflection, faintly tired eyes, steady hands, the faint outline of someone learning what solitude really means. The next few days unfolded like a slow unraveling. Jackson called my office, left messages with my assistant, even reached out to a few clients pretending it was urgent family business. Tara handled each incident with firm professionalism. "You don't need to engage," she reminded me. "Every response feeds the pattern." On Friday afternoon, a courier arrived with a thick envelope addressed to me. Inside was a formal letter, a cease and desist notice from Tara to Jackson, sent that morning after his last threatening email. Seeing my brother's name printed on legal paper made everything real in a way words hadn't yet. That night, I sat outside on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cool air. The stars were faint behind thin clouds. I could hear distant traffic, the hum of the world moving forward. I thought about Tommy, how young he was, how much of this wasn't his fault. Somewhere inside that tangle of guilt and sadness, a small part of me hoped he'd remember me kindly one day. The weekend passed quietly. I walked in the park near the river, watched families with strollers and coffee cups, and wondered how many of them carried stories they never told. Back home, I cooked a simple meal, the first in weeks that I actually tasted. By Monday, news began to reach me through other people. Elena's neighbor mentioned that Jackson's car had been repossessed. Someone else said Vanessa's posts had turned cryptic quotes about fake friends and starting over. I didn't feel triumphant, just hollow and tired. Consequences weren't revenge. They were the end of gravity finally taking hold. That evening, I opened my laptop again. My financial dashboard glowed with clean numbers, no shared debts, no unknown obligations. For the first time since my 20s, every dollar attached to my name belonged to me. Still, guilt lingered at the edges. I tried to picture my parents sitting in their living room, the news of my decisions rippling through the space like a draft. They had always believed peace was worth any silence, even if it meant letting wrong things stand. I wondered what they were telling themselves now. Later that night, my doorbell rang. The sound startled me. It was late, almost 11. I froze, then glanced through the peephole. Jackson's car, again headlights still on his outline, just visible. He stood on the porch, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I didn't open the door. He knocked, called my name loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I stayed where I was, heart pounding. After a minute, he shouted once more, frustration cracking his voice, then turned and walked away. The sound of his car backing out of the driveway lingered long after he was gone. The next morning, a new email waited. It was from Vanessa, softer in tone this time. She wrote that Tommy was asking about me, that he wanted to apologize. "Can't we meet for his sake?" she said again. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. The pattern was too familiar bait wrapped in guilt. I forwarded it to Tara and left it at that. A few days later, Tara called again. "You're going to start hearing less from them," she said. "The banks have accepted the releases. They're on their own now." The silence that followed her words was profound. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That night, the house felt lighter, though nothing in it had changed. I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea, looking around the room where the worst of it had happened. The floor gleamed under the overhead light, no trace of frosting or raspberries, only the faint reflection of the tulips I'd replaced. Their petals had begun to open slow and deliberate, like something remembering how to breathe. I thought of the moment Tommy pushed that cake to the floor, of the way I'd stood there holding the knife and saying nothing. Maybe silence had been my armor then, but now it felt like choice. Before bed, I walked through each room, turning off lights, locking windows, moving in a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. In the living room, I paused by the framed photo of my first office staff, the early days when everything felt possible. Their smiles were wide, unburdened. I touched the edge of the frame and whispered to myself, "You're still here." As I climbed into bed, the house sighed around me, settling into the quiet. The darkness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. In the morning, the world would move on emails, deadlines, maybe another message from someone trying to rewrite the story. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I felt the space between fear and freedom stretch open just enough to breathe. I closed my eyes and let it fill me. The first hint of spring came, quietly soft air through open windows, the faint smell of wet soil and sunlight stretching further into the evenings. Life outside my house had moved on. Yet mine still felt suspended between two worlds, the one I had walked away from, and the one slowly taking shape without them. 2 weeks after the last message from my family, I sat across from Brian in his office again. He slid a new stack of papers toward me, each one clean and final. "All co-signed loans have been released," he said. "The banks approved the adjustments this morning. You're officially clear." The words landed like a sigh I didn't realize I'd been holding. For the first time in years, I owed nothing to anyone. My shoulders relaxed, as if some invisible weight had been unhooked. "You did the hard part," Brian said, offering a small smile. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars hummed along the street. The breeze lifted the edges of old leaves. I walked slowly to my car, letting the sound of traffic fill the quiet corners inside me. Freedom didn't come with fireworks. It came in the form of space, to breathe, to choose to stop answering every call that demanded something from me. Still, that evening, guilt found me again. It came in small thoughts, my mother's aging hands, my father's quiet sighs when bills arrived, the look on Tommy's face the last time I saw him. Consequences were unfolding for everyone now, and I felt their weight even from a distance. By the end of that week, the first ripples reached me through other people. Elena's coworker mentioned that Jackson and Vanessa had listed their house for sale. Another message came from an old college acquaintance who'd seen Vanessa's posts about starting over. Each piece of news felt both distant and too close, like echoes in a long hallway. I wasn't looking for updates, but they found me anyway. My parents stayed silent until one morning in early May, when a thin envelope arrived, addressed in my father's handwriting. The paper was cream-colored and formal. Inside was a letter written in his neat, careful script. Dedra, your mother and I are planning to sell the house and move near Uncle Jim in Arizona. The market is good, and it's time. Your mother's arthritis will do better in a drier climate. We wish you well, and hope you're taking care of yourself. There was no apology, no mention of the birthday, or the text that had ended everything. Just a quiet acceptance that our lives were moving in different directions. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. The absence of bitterness almost felt like a kindness. When I told Elena, she said, "Maybe that's the closest they know how to come to saying sorry." Maybe, I replied. Weeks slipped by. My work thrived in ways I hadn't expected. Without family crises to absorb my focus, I found clarity I'd been missing for years. My firm landed 2 major clients, and I spent long days in the studio again, sketching designs that felt alive. Evenings were no longer filled with guilt or phone calls, only the soft hum of music and the steady rhythm of peace. But quiet doesn't erase grief. It only gives it room to breathe. Some nights, I would walk past the guest rooms and remember who they were meant for. I had designed this house to hold my family, not to hold silence. I'd linger in the hallway, touching the doorframes, as if they could still feel warmth. By early summer, I received a second letter, this time from my parents' lawyer. I hesitated before opening it, the memory of that family group text still echoing somewhere in me. The letter was practical, almost cold. They were removing me from their will and medical directives. The words were legal, not emotional, but beneath them, I sensed something else, a strange acknowledgement that boundaries were real, now even to them. I folded the papers neatly and placed them in the drawer with my financial records. Instead of pain, I felt a calm understanding. This, too, was closure. Elena celebrated with me that evening. We sat on my patio with glasses of chilled wine as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue. "So that's it," she said softly. "You're finally untangled." I nodded. It doesn't feel like an ending, more like the ground stopped moving. A few days later, I booked a ticket to Italy, a trip I'd postponed for years. I wanted to see the buildings that had first made me fall in love with architecture, the cathedrals, the courtyards, the play of light through arches that have stood for centuries. The flight was long and quiet, and when I stepped out into the warm air of Rome, something inside me opened. For 10 days, I wandered through stone streets and wide plazas, sketchbook in hand. I sat at cafe tables, watching how people moved, how they lingered over coffee, how they spoke with their hands, how they looked, unhurried, even in motion. I realized I'd lived most of my life rushing to solve problems that weren't mine. In Italy, time seemed to stretch, reminding me that peace has its own rhythm. When I returned home, I redecorated the dining room. The same one that had witnessed the worst moment of my life now held soft colors and sunlight. I replaced the heavy tablecloth with something simple and clean. The tulips in the vase reached toward the window, their petals thin as light. One afternoon, while unpacking a framed photograph from my trip, I found myself thinking of Tommy. It had been nearly 6 months since that day, and I still sent small gifts to my parents' old address books, puzzles, things that might find their way to him. There was never a response, but I kept sending them anyway. That evening, as the sky dimmed, I stood in the kitchen and baked the same cake I had made for my birthday. 3 layers of chocolate with raspberry filling. The familiar scent filled the house rich and warm. When it was done, I carried a slice to the patio, sat down, and ate slowly, while the sun sank behind the trees. No one was there to sing or clap or make small talk, but the quiet felt right. I tasted each bite unhurried, letting it remind me that joy doesn't need witnesses. Later that week, my cousin Rachel reached out. We hadn't spoken in years. Her message was brief. "I've heard some things, but I'd rather hear from you. Would you meet for coffee?" I hesitated, unsure if opening that door again was wise. But curiosity and something softer won. We met at a small cafe downtown on a rainy Tuesday. She looked older, but her smile was the same. Over steaming cups of coffee, we talked carefully, at first circling around old family stories. Then she said, "You were always the only one who stood up to Jackson. I remember being a kid, watching you tell him to stop picking on me. Everyone acted like his behavior was harmless, but you saw it." Her words loosened something I hadn't realized was still tight in me. We talked for hours, not about blame, but about survival, how each of us had learned to manage the same undercurrent of family silence. When we parted, she hugged me tightly and said, "You make me want to set my own boundaries too." Driving home in the rain, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Maybe the past didn't have to stay broken. Maybe healing could happen in small, steady circles. As the weeks passed, I began meeting Rachel more often. Sometimes we'd talk about work, other times about how family patterns ripple through generations. Those conversations became small moments of repair proof that some things can grow again in the cracks left behind. By early autumn, my life felt full in a new way. My firm expanded, hiring 3 new architects. I began mentoring younger women, especially those struggling to find their footing against family pressure. One of them, Zoe, reminded me of my younger self, brilliant but afraid to say no. When she confessed she was covering her brother's rent again, I told her gently, "You can love people without losing yourself to them." She nodded slowly, as if the thought was new. The following weekend, I hosted a small dinner for my closest friends. There were candles on the table, music low in the background, laughter soft but steady. At one point, I looked around the room and realized every person there was someone who gave without expecting to take. The kind of family you build, not the kind you're born into. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood in the doorway and looked out at the quiet street. A soft wind moved through the trees, scattering a few early leaves. The air carried that faint scent of change that always comes before fall. I thought about the months behind me, the cake, the silence, the letters, the release. I thought about how peace doesn't announce itself. It just arrives one evening when you finally stop expecting the phone to ring. I turned off the lights, leaving only the lamp in the corner, and walked through the stillness of my home. Every step felt steady, every breath clean. For the first time, I understood what it meant to belong to your own life. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass, and I let it carry me into the quiet of a night that no longer asked anything from me. The last light of autumn filtered through the living room windows, brushing the walls in gold. The wind outside carried a dry rustle of leaves against the porch, and the scent of rain drifted through a half-open window. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels full instead of empty. I stood by the dining table, my hand resting on its smooth surface. For a moment, I saw a reflection of that day, the cake, the silence, the broken pieces I swept away. But now the table held something different, a vase of wildflowers from the farmer's market, and a stack of drawings from my latest project. The memory had lost its sting. It no longer owned the room. I turned off the light and stepped out onto the patio. The air was cool, the sun a faint ember sinking into the horizon. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. and laughter drifted faintly from a nearby house. Life was still happening all around me, messy, ordinary, and good. 6 months had passed since my cousin Rachel and I started meeting for coffee. Our talks had become a ritual of sorts, equal parts laughter and unspoken healing. She'd tell me about her new job, about learning to say no to her mother's demands without guilt. I'd listen, recognizing echoes of my own younger self in her stories. Every time we parted, she'd hug me tightly and say, "We're getting better." And she was right. The firm had grown faster than I'd imagined. New contracts, new faces, new ideas that stretched what I thought possible. I had moved the office downtown into a bright corner suite with high ceilings and sunlight that poured through all afternoon. Zoe, my youngest architect, had flourished. One afternoon, she came into my office with a shaky smile and said she finally told her brother she couldn't pay his rent anymore. "He hung up on me," she said. "But I feel lighter." I remember smiling, recognizing that feeling like a mirror held up to my own past. "That's what freedom sounds like," I told her. At home, I found peace in small rituals, the hum of the coffee maker in the morning, the soft light over the sink at night, the way the air shifted when I opened the front door to the day. I'd learned to cook not for gatherings, but for myself. Simple meals, fresh herbs, food eaten slowly at the kitchen island, while music played low in the background. David came into my life gently, without demand or pretense. We met through a collaborative project, a sustainable housing design, and our conversations started with blueprints and slowly unfolded into late dinners and shared walks. He never filled the silence with solutions. He just listened, steady and unhurried, his presence a quiet reassurance that not every relationship had to cost something. One evening, months after we began seeing each other, we were sitting on my porch, watching the light fade behind the trees. He said, "You've built a beautiful life here." I looked around, taking in the garden I'd planted, the house that once held so much tension. "I guess I finally stopped trying to build it for everyone else." He smiled. "That's why it works." There wasn't a need for grand gestures. His warmth fit easily into the calm I'd worked so hard to protect. Some nights, we'd stay up late talking about architecture, art, or nothing at all, just sharing quiet space that didn't ask for performance or apology. The first letter from my father arrived near Christmas. The handwriting was still careful, though, shakier than before. "Dedra, your mother and I are settled now. The air here helps her breathing, and we found a small community that feels right. We heard you won another design award. Congratulations. Mom wanted me to tell you she saw a photo online. She said you looked happy. We both hope that's true." It wasn't an apology. It was something quieter, acknowledgement, maybe even pride. I read it twice and let it sit on my desk for a week before I replied. "Dad, I'm glad you're both comfortable there. Work has been fulfilling, and I am happy more than I've been in a long time. Tell Mom I'm glad she's feeling better. Stay well. No accusations. No reopening of wounds. Just balance." A few weeks later, Rachel mentioned that Jackson and Vanessa were living in a smaller apartment closer to the city. "They're quieter now," she said. "Less show, more surviving." I nodded, unsure how I felt. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, just a distant sense of inevitability. When you stop rescuing people, they finally have to learn to swim. What brought me unexpected comfort was hearing that Tommy was doing well at his new school. Rachel's daughter had seen him at a field trip, smiling, laughing, telling stories about building things with his dad. I closed my eyes at that detail. Maybe in his own way, he was learning something good from all of this. Maybe the cycle had shifted for him before it was too late. By the time spring returned, the house felt different. I'd painted the guest room in soft blues and turned it into a small library, shelves filled with design books, poetry, and a few old photographs that didn't hurt to look at anymore. The other room became a yoga space, light, open, peaceful. There was no trace of waiting for family visits, no sense of obligation hanging in the air. Every inch of the house finally reflected who I was, not who I had tried to please. One Sunday morning, I baked a chocolate raspberry cake again. The same recipe, the same measured patience flour smoothed level with the back of a spoon, chocolate melted to a glossy sheen. The scent filled the house, mingling with the sound of rain against the windows. When it cooled, I cut a single slice and carried it outside. The garden had begun to bloom early lavender, a hint of rosebuds, the soft hum of bees nearby. I sat on the porch and ate my cake slowly, each bite rich and deliberate. It wasn't celebration or defiance. It was peace, simple and whole. Elena stopped by that afternoon, dropping off a bouquet from her backyard. "You've come a long way from that day," she said, arranging the stems in a jar. "I had to," I answered. There wasn't anywhere else to go. We laughed softly, the kind of laughter that doesn't erase pain, but respects what it took to get through it. As evening fell, the sky turned a pale violet, the air warm against my skin. I walked through each room of my home, lights glowing softly, the rhythm of my footsteps steady against the hardwood floors. The spaces no longer echoed, they sang in quiet harmony with the life I had built. When I reached the front door, I paused. Outside, the last light lingered on the horizon, and for a moment, everything stood still. The wind, the distant hum of the street, even the beating of my own heart. I thought about the version of myself who had once knelt on this floor cleaning the ruins of a cake and a lifetime of silence. I wanted to tell her she would make it here to this calm, this freedom, this gentle certainty that she was enough all along. Peace, I realized, wasn't a destination. It was a decision I had made every day since. I turned off the porch light and let the dusk wrap around me. The scent of rain deepened, and the world felt beautifully ordinary. Some wounds I've learned don't fade because time heals them. They fade because we stop feeding them. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you've ever found the courage to choose peace over chaos, share that moment in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength and second chances. The light dimmed beyond the trees, and the air settled into stillness. I took one last breath of the evening and whispered to myself, almost smiling, "You're home now."